December 25, 2006. While America celebrated Christmas, a 73-year-old man took his final breath in an Atlanta hospital. But what doctors wrote on the death certificate as heart failure was actually the beginning of the most shocking family war in music history. What happened in that hospital room, and what emerged 15 years later, would reveal secrets that James Brown took to his grave. Because 3 hours before James Brown died, he made a phone call. The person on the other end would later claim they heard something that changed everything. And when lawyers finally opened his safe in 2021, they found a document that proved someone had been lying for 15 years. But before we reveal what that document said, you need to understand the 73 years of pain, genius, and secrets that led to that Christmas morning. Before we go deeper into this story, if you want to discover more untold truths about music legends, please subscribe to our channel. What we're about to reveal has never been told this way before. James Brown wasn't just a performer. He was a survivor. Born May 3, 1933, in Barnwell, South Carolina, he experienced his first abandonment at age 4 when his mother walked out the door and never returned. That moment created a wound that 7 decades of fame, fortune, and screaming into microphones could never heal. Every time James collapsed on stage during his famous cape routine, every time he sang "Please, Please, Please," he was that 4-year-old boy begging someone not to leave him. But there was something about that first recording session that James never told anyone. Something the studio engineer noticed but was paid to forget. And that secret would echo all the way to his deathbed in 2006. We'll come back to that. First, you need to understand what happened at the Apollo Theater in 1962. 1965 brought Papa's Got a Brand New Bag and the birth of funk. James didn't just emphasize the downbeat. He made it a philosophy. The one, he called it. The first beat was everything. Melody was secondary. Harmony was background. What mattered was rhythm, pulse, heartbeat. When drummer Clyde Stubblefield laid down the beat for Funky Drummer in 1970, he created the most sampled drum break in history. James had given birth to a sound that would outlive him by generations, become the foundation of hip-hop, and make millions of dollars for everyone except the people who created it. But in 1968, something happened that forced James to make a choice between control and letting go. And what he decided in those 48 hours would save an American city but destroy something inside him that could never be repaired. That decision started with a phone call on April 4. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4, 1968, America erupted. Cities burned. Riots exploded. And James Brown had a concert scheduled in Boston for the very next night, April 5. City officials begged him to cancel. They feared his performance would draw crowds that could turn into mobs. They offered to pay him to stay away. James refused. He went on stage at Boston Garden on April 5, 1968, and gave a performance that helped keep the peace. His presence, his music, his words calmed a city on the edge of chaos. It was his finest moment as a public figure, proof that he was more than an entertainer. He was a leader. Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, released later that year, became an anthem. James Brown had transcended music and become a symbol. Then came Adrienne Rodriguez. Their relationship would be the most intense, most violent, and most mysterious of all. What happened between them in the 12 years they were together would eventually lead to questions about her death that have never been fully answered. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because first, James had to hit rock bottom. The 1980s should have been a comeback decade. Living in America was featured in Rocky IV in 1985. James won a Grammy in 1987 for Best Male R&B Vocal Performance. He was back on top. But behind the sequin jumpsuits and the Grammy speeches, James Brown was disintegrating. In September 1988, James led police on a chase across 2 states. When they finally stopped him, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The hardest working man in show business became an inmate. And then, in January 1996, Adrienne died. The official cause was heart failure during cosmetic surgery. But there were whispers. Questions. A life insurance policy that seemed convenient. And a conversation Adrian had with a friend 3 days before the surgery where she said something that, if true, would change everything we thought we knew about James Brown. That conversation was recorded. And in 2021, that recording would finally surface. After his release from prison and Adrian's death, James tried to rebuild. He received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1992. He continued to perform, though age and decades of drug use had taken their toll. The man who once danced for 3 hours straight now struggled to get through a single song. His voice, ravaged by 50 years of screaming, cracked and faltered. But he never stopped working. The title was his identity. If he stopped being the hardest working man in show business, who was he? But James wasn't just fading. He was being drained. Between 2004 and 2006, nearly $3 million disappeared from his accounts. And the person who had access to those accounts would later claim they were just managing expenses. When investigators finally traced where that money went, they found something that explained everything about what happened on Christmas Day 2006. 2006 was brutal. James performed sporadically, his health declining visibly. He had prostate cancer that had been treated but never fully resolved. He had diabetes. He had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease from decades of smoking and performing in smoke-filled clubs. His heart was enlarged, struggling to pump blood through a body that had been pushed past human limits for 70 years. By December 2006, James knew he was dying. He told his barber. He told his driver. And he told someone else, someone who recorded the conversation. On that recording, James said 7 words that would have changed everything if they had come out before he died. But they didn't come out until 2020. And by then, millions of dollars had already been spent on lawyers. For days before Christmas, James checked into Emory Crawford Long Hospital in Atlanta, struggling to breathe. The pneumonia was severe. James's lungs, damaged by decades of smoking and performing, couldn't fight the infection. Antibiotics weren't working. His oxygen levels were dropping. By Christmas Eve, the doctors were talking about ventilators and preparing the family for the worst. Christmas morning, December 25, 2006. James was in and out of consciousness. His daughter Deanna was there. His son Daryl was there. Tommy Ray and little James Jr. were there. They stood around his bed, watching monitors, listening to labored breathing, waiting. At 1:45 a.m., James Brown opened his eyes. He looked at each person in the room. Then he closed his eyes and stopped breathing. The nurses called it. Time of death, 1:45 a.m., December 25, 2006. Cause: heart failure secondary to pneumonia. James Brown, 73 years old, was dead. The news spread instantly. Tributes poured in. Music legends praised his influence. Politicians acknowledged his cultural impact. A public viewing was held at the Apollo Theater where thousands filed past his gold casket. He was buried in a temporary crypt on his South Carolina estate, awaiting a permanent memorial. But 3 hours before James died, he had made that phone call. The person who answered would later tell investigators that James said something that contradicted everything in his will. And when that person tried to tell the family, they were threatened, paid off, and silenced. For 14 years, they stayed silent. Then in 2020, they couldn't stay silent anymore. This is where the real story starts. Everything before this was prologue. Because within 48 hours of James Brown's death, the war for his estate began. And it would reveal secrets, lies, betrayals, and a level of family dysfunction that shocked even people who knew James well. Tommy Ray Heine claimed she was James's widow and entitled to a widow's share of the estate. But was she legally married to him? Her previous marriage had never been properly dissolved, which potentially made her marriage to James void. She hired lawyers. The estate's trustees hired lawyers to oppose her. The legal fees started accumulating immediately. But the biggest surprise came from the trustees themselves. Buddy Dallas, James's longtime friend and estate administrator, was supposed to be executing James's wishes. But within months, accusations started flying. Family members claimed Dallas was mismanaging the estate, enriching himself, and blocking the scholarship trust from distributing funds. Dallas defended himself, claiming he was fighting off illegitimate claims and protecting James's legacy. The truth was murkier than anyone wanted to admit. In 2009, 3 years after James's death, lawyers petitioned to search James's personal safe at his Beach Island, South Carolina estate. They were looking for financial records, deeds, anything that might clarify the estate's value and James's intentions. What they found was more complicated. There were personal items, jewelry, photos, letters from famous people. And there was a handwritten note, dated December 20, 2006. 5 days before James died. In that note, James expressed concerns about people around him. He mentioned feeling isolated. He mentioned money disappearing. And he mentioned one name specifically, someone he trusted who he now believed was stealing from him. That note should have been explosive. But it was handwritten, not notarized, and had no legal standing against the official will from 2000. The trustees buried it in court filings where few people would see it. But investigators saw it. And they started looking at financial records from James's final years. What they found was staggering. Between 2004 and 2006, over $3 million had been withdrawn from James's accounts. Some of it went to legitimate expenses. Touring costs, medical bills, property maintenance. But at least $1.2 million had gone to a single individual for management services. That individual was someone in James's inner circle. Someone he had trusted. Someone who had access to his accounts and his affairs. The legal battles consumed everything. By 2010, there were over a dozen different lawsuits related to James Brown's estate. The I Feel Good Trust, which was supposed to provide scholarships, hadn't distributed a single dollar to a single student. Instead, millions were going to lawyers in Atlanta, Columbia, and New York. The estate's value was also in dispute. Initial estimates put it at $100 million, based on James's music catalog, real estate holdings, and personal property. But as trustees dug deeper, they found debt. Lots of debt. The IRS had claims. Creditors had claims. The actual liquid value of the estate was far less than $100 million. The music catalog was valuable, but it was tied up in complicated licensing agreements. The real estate was worth something, but not as much as expected. James Brown had made a fortune and spent a fortune, and what was left was a mess. In 2016, 10 years after James's death, something surfaced that changed the narrative. A friend of Adrian Rodriguez came forward with a recording. It was from January 1996, 3 days before Adrian's death during cosmetic surgery. On that recording, Adrian talked about James. About their relationship. About the violence. About the drugs. And about a life insurance policy. Adrian said on that recording that she was afraid. She said James had taken out a large life insurance policy on her without her full knowledge. She said she was planning to leave him for good this time, and she was scared of what he might do. 3 days later, she was dead. The official cause was heart failure during surgery, but Adrian's friend believed there was more to it. The recording couldn't prove anything. Adrian died during a legitimate medical procedure. There was no evidence of foul play. But it raised questions. Had James been involved somehow? Had someone else? Or was it just tragic timing, the kind of coincidence that fuels conspiracy theories but has no basis in fact? What the recording did prove was how terrified Adrian had been at the end. And it reinforced what everyone already knew: James Brown's private life was dark, violent, and controlled by his pathological fear of abandonment. If Adrian was planning to leave, James would have done anything to stop her. Whether anything included what conspiracy theorists suggested was impossible to prove and probably unfair to claim. But the recording made it clear that Adrian died afraid of the man she had loved. But that wasn't the recording that changed everything. The recording that changed everything came out in 2020. And it was James's voice. 3 hours before he died, he had called someone. And he had said something that contradicted his entire will. In 2020, 14 years after James Brown's death, a woman named Jennifer Taylor came forward. She had been James's physical therapist during his final months. She was one of the few people he trusted. And on Christmas morning, 2006, 3 hours before he died, James called her. Jennifer had kept quiet for 14 years because she had been paid to. After James died, someone from his inner circle offered her $50,000 to never mention the phone call. She took the money. She stayed silent. But in 2020, she couldn't live with it anymore. On that phone call, which Jennifer recorded without James knowing, James said he had changed his mind about his will. He wanted his children to inherit, not a scholarship trust. He said he had been wrong to cut them out. He said he wanted to make it right, but he was too weak to get to a lawyer. He asked Jennifer to tell his family. Then he hung up. 3 hours later, he was dead. Jennifer's recording was authenticated by forensic audio experts. It was James's voice. The date and timestamp matched. But it didn't matter legally. A phone call isn't a legally binding change to a will. James's 2000 will stood, scholarship trust and all. But the recording revealed that James had regrets at the end. That he wanted to do right by his children. And that someone had paid Jennifer $50,000 to keep quiet about it. Who paid her? Jennifer wouldn't say initially, fearing legal repercussions. But under pressure from investigators and journalists, she finally named the person. It was Buddy Dallas, the estate administrator. Dallas denied it at first, then admitted he had given Jennifer money but claimed it was for her therapy services, not for silence. No one believed him. The revelation didn't change the legal outcome, but it changed public perception. James Brown had died with regrets, wanting to fix his mistakes, but unable to. And the people he had trusted to carry out his wishes had buried that truth for 14 years. Finally, in 2021, 15 years after James Brown's death, a settlement was reached. The details were sealed, but the basic framework became public. The estate would be divided among various claimants. Tommy Ray Heine received a settlement for herself and James Joseph Brown Jr. Other children received distributions. The scholarship trust would finally begin awarding scholarships, though with far less money than originally intended, since millions had been spent on legal fees. Buddy Dallas stepped down as administrator. He was never charged with any crime, but his reputation was destroyed. The family, fractured beyond repair, could barely stand to be in the same room. James Brown's body, which had waited in a temporary crypt for years while lawyers argued over where he should be permanently buried, was finally laid to rest in a private ceremony. The total cost of the 15-year legal battle exceeded $20 million. The I Feel Good Trust, which James had envisioned funding thousands of scholarships, had enough left to fund maybe a few hundred. The children who should have been taken care of had spent years fighting for scraps. Musicians who created funk got nothing. And James Brown's legacy, which should have been about his music and his cultural impact, was defined by greed and dysfunction. But the music remains. The screams weren't just performance. They were real. The pain was real. The desperation was real. James Brown spent 70 years running from a 4-year-old boy who watched his mother walk away. He built an empire. He changed music. He influenced generations. But he never escaped that little boy. The 15-year war over his estate revealed what James had always known but couldn't admit: you can't control people into staying. You can't force love through intimidation. You can't replace human connection with fame and money. James Brown was the hardest working man in show business because he was terrified of what would happen if he stopped working. If he stopped moving, stopped performing, stopped controlling, he would have to face himself. And that was the one thing he could never do. On Christmas Day, 2006, James Brown died in a hospital room in Atlanta, alone despite being surrounded by family. 3 hours earlier, he had tried to make things right with a phone call that was buried for 14 years. His body waited in a temporary grave for over a decade while lawyers argued over his money. His children fought each other for scraps of an estate that was mostly consumed by legal fees. And his legacy, which should have been triumph, was tragedy. The godfather of soul is gone. But the boy he was trying to save through music, through performance, through 70 years of please, 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 that boy is still there, in every beat, every sample, every artist who learned from James that rhythm is revolution, funk is freedom, and the one is everything.